"You are about to marry the billionaire's daughter," Tobias said in the small chapel vestry, brushing a thread off Daniel's lapel. "Try to look like a man who deserves her." "I will try," Daniel said. "Try harder," Tobias said. "The watch is ticking. Hers, mine, and your father's." Daniel set his hand briefly on the inside pocket of the jacket. The watch was, as Tobias had pointed out, ticking against his ribs. He stood at the altar of the small chapel on the Crown family estate and felt the steady, second-hand pulse of his father's pocket watch through the lining of his jacket. And for one full breath, he understood that he had won. He had walked into a room that 20 years ago had not even known his father's name, and the room had opened to him. The pews were full of money. Pearl, the housekeeper, stood at the back like a witness at a trial. Edward Crown sat in the front row with his hands folded the way a man folds his hands when he is letting other people speak. And then the door at the end of the aisle opened, and the billionaire's daughter walked toward him in a column of cool ivory silk. And Daniel Hawthorne, who had not let himself sweat in a meeting since he was 25, felt his palms go damp. She was not what she had been at the door of the foundation office 2 years ago, when he had walked in with a folder and a plan. She was not even what she had been 3 weeks ago at the rehearsal, smoothing the back of her left thumb across her ring finger, as though she were checking for a ring that was not yet there. She was something in between. Composed, light-footed, the small, careful smile of a woman who had spent 15 years training herself not to look surprised in public. And yet, here, under the soft chapel light, her eyes moved when she found him at the altar, and something behind the composure shifted half a degree, as if she had not, until this moment, fully believed the day was real. He wanted to look away. He could not. That was the first thing that broke. He had spent 2 years engineering this walk down this aisle. Every quarterly meeting his small firm had won on the Crown Foundation books. Every dinner he had let himself be seated next to her at. Every conversation in which he had chosen the next, exactly correct sentence. And he had pictured this moment so many times that he had stopped picturing her in it at all. In his mind, she had become a function, a door he was opening. The door was opening now, and there was a woman inside it. His father's watch ticked once against his ribs, dry and methodical, the way it had ticked on the kitchen table in 2006, when his father had sat with his head in his hands and a foreclosure notice in front of him. The way it had ticked the morning Daniel had found him, still sitting there at 6 in the morning. And Daniel, who had been 13 years old then, had understood without anyone needing to say it, that a man could be broken in a way that no shop, and no bank, and no court was going to fix. He had been 13 years old. He had been carrying that watch ever since. "I'm sorry," he thought, with a particular interior clarity that only ever came to him in chapels. "I'm sorry, Dad, that the only way I could find to put your name back on a door was to walk down an aisle toward a woman who didn't sign the papers that closed yours." Margot Crown reached the altar. Her father did not stand. That, Daniel noticed. Edward sat with his hands folded and his chin slightly lifted, and watched his daughter the way a man watches a transaction he is not entirely sure he authorized. Margot, if she felt the lack, did not show it. She turned the small, public, gracious turn of a person who had been turning for cameras since she was a teenager, and she lifted her face to Daniel's, and she said, under her breath only for him, "You look terrified." Daniel laughed, which he had not planned to do. Yeah," he said. It was the truest sentence he had spoken in 2 years, and he had not meant to say it. The officiant began. Words travelled across them like weather. Daniel heard about half of them. He kept the other half of his attention on the steady tick of the watch against his ribs, and on the way her thumb, when she gave him her hand to receive the ring, moved once across her ring finger, in the small, private, reflexive gesture she did not know she was doing. And he understood, with the slow falling sensation of a man who has just looked down from a height he did not realize he had climbed, that he was going to have to find a way to live with what he was doing to her. The ring slid on. She did not flinch. Her fingers closed around his for one count longer than the script required. He kissed her, briefly, formally, the way a man kisses a wife in a chapel full of his wife's father's friends. She smelled like cold rain and a faint, warm spice he could not identify yet, but would learn, in 3 weeks' time, was a tea she drank only in the mornings when she had not slept. Her free hand rested on the lapel above his pocket. Above the watch, she could not feel it ticking through the layers of wool and silk and lining and the careful, expensive cut of a suit he had bought specifically for this morning. He knew that. He understood, with the precise, rational understanding of a man who has cost-modelled this transaction for 2 years, that the watch was an interior fact, available only to him. He felt her hand on his lapel anyway, and he thought, with the surprise of a man who has just lost his footing on his own floor, she's going to find it. Not today, not tomorrow, but she is going to find it. Quietly, my dear, Edward said to no one. The chapel rose. Edward Crown rose with them, finally, and Daniel, turning with his new wife on his arm to walk back down the aisle past every face that had not, 6 months ago, known he existed, looked at Edward Crown for the first time as a son-in-law, and not as a stranger. And Edward Crown looked back at him for the first time as a son-in-law, and not as a vendor. Frankly, the look said, you are now closer to me than my own lawyers. Daniel made himself smile. He walked his wife into the spring light. Margot Crown had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had told herself, the night before, that she would sleep. She had taken the careful precautions of a woman who has been planning weddings for clients all year and knows the cost of an exhausted bride in photographs. No caffeine after 2, no screens after 9, the linen sheets her mother had ordered for this room when Margot was 8 years old and had not slept well during a thunderstorm. Catherine had said, as she made the bed up around her, that linen forgave a person who could not be still. Margot still believed her about that. Mind the linen, Pearl said, half to no one. The linen had not forgiven her at 4 in the morning. She had lain in the dark of her old bedroom on the Crown estate, the bedroom she had not slept in regularly in 9 years. And she had listened to the house breathing the way it had always breathed, the slow expansion of old radiators, and the small, considered creaks of a staircase that had been climbed by quiet people for almost a century. And she had thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 15 years learning how to manage the morning of an event, I do not know this man well enough to marry him. She had thought it once. She had let it pass. She had thought it again, more carefully, at 4:15, and at 4:40, and at 5, and at 5:30. And each time she had laid the thought aside, the way she laid aside the small, anxious objections a foundation director learned to lay aside before a board meeting. Yes, she did not know him as well as she had known the man she had been engaged to at 22. Yes, the engagement had been brief, and the courtship before it had been efficient, and her father's silence on the subject had been louder than her father's silence usually was. Yes, all of it. She had also been 22 when she had told her father she was marrying the last man, and Edward had not stopped her, and she had been right then, in a way she had not been right since, that her father had known something about that man that he was not going to tell her until it was too late to save her. She had spent the 5 years since training herself never to be in that position again. This was, she thought, lying in the dark of her childhood bed at 5:30 in the morning of her second wedding, the position again. She got out of bed. She made her own coffee in the small kitchenette down the hall that had been put in for her mother when Catherine had been ill, in a year Margot did not let herself think about by date. She did not ring for Pearl. She did not want to be performed for, today, by a person who loved her. She wanted the small, anonymous comfort of standing in a kitchen, barefoot, at 5:45, and watching steam rise from a kettle that did not know what day it was. Her father came in at 6 exactly. Edward Crown, in a pre-event morning, was Edward Crown in any other morning, which was the most exhausting thing about him. He was already in a charcoal suit. He had the Wall Street Journal folded under one arm. He took the second cup that Margot had not yet decided whether to pour, and he poured it himself. And he sat down at the small table by the window, in the way he had been sitting down at small tables by windows in his daughter's various kitchens for 36 years. You did not sleep, he said. No, Margot said. He did not ask why. He never did. He had not asked why she had not slept the week before her engagement broke 5 years ago, either, when she had assumed, wrongly, that he did not know it was breaking. She wished, with the small, persistent wish of an adult child, that he would, just once, ask. "Daniel is at the chapel," he said instead. "He arrived at 5:40. Your housekeeper says he is sitting in the second pew with his foreman friend, and they are arguing about which pocket the rings should be in." "Tobias," Margot said. "The friend is Tobias." "Tobias," her father said, as if filing the name for later use. Outside the kitchen window, the lawn was the silver grey of a March morning on the Hudson, and a single Canada goose was walking across it with the deliberate, judgmental gait of a creature who had inherited the property from a previous generation. Margot watched it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Her left thumb crossed her ring finger in the small, private, automatic gesture she had been making since the morning the last engagement had ended. And Edward Crown, who saw everything and acknowledged almost none of it, set down his journal and said, almost gently, "You can still postpone." Margot looked up. It was, she thought, the closest thing to a sincere question her father had asked her in 5 years, possibly ever. He had not phrased it as a question. He had given her the door, in the form of a statement, and now he was sitting very still on the other side of the door and waiting to see whether she would walk through it. She set the cup down. "Frankly," she said, and stopped and corrected, because that was his word and not hers, and she had learned long ago not to borrow it. "No, I can't." He nodded once. He did not ask why not. She did not know whether she was grateful for that, or whether it was, again, the precise, small disappointment that had been the shape of his attention all her life. She drank the rest of her coffee standing up, the way she ate almonds at her own kitchen island when she was anxious, and she went upstairs at 6:30 to begin the long, public morning of becoming a wife. The dress was the column of ivory silk her grandmother had been married in. Pearl pinned the small alterations at the small of her back with the cool, practical efficiency of a woman who had pinned a great many alterations into a great many crown dresses across a great many years. And at one point, Pearl, who never expressed sentiment directly, said to the mirror, "And that is meant to be the dress that fixes everything, is it?" Margot, who had been holding her shoulders the way one holds them for photographs, dropped them 1/2 inch. "No," she said. "Good," Pearl said, and put another pin in. At 8:30, Margot stood at the back of the chapel with her father's arm under her hand and waited for the music to change. Edward looked down at her. His face, which did not normally do anything visible, did something very small and very contained, the way a man with very good manners adjusts his posture when he feels a sudden draft. "He is not who you think he is," Edward said very quietly into her hair. Margot's hand tightened on his arm. "Neither am I," she said. The door opened, the music began, and the billionaire's daughter walked down the aisle toward the man she had married for reasons that she could not, even at 4 a.m, in linen sheets her dead mother had chosen, fully name to herself. At the altar he was already watching her. His face did something her father's never did. It moved. She thought, in the small, undignified, completely unmanageable interior space of a woman halfway down an aisle. Oh. Then she smiled the small, public smile she had been smiling since she was 11 years old, and she walked the rest of the way to him, and she said, under her breath, only for him, that he looked terrified, because it was the only thing she could think of that he could not have prepared for. And when he laughed, a startled, off-script, working man's laugh that the chapel was not built to absorb, she felt, against every careful objection she had laid aside since 4 a.m, the smallest, warmest, most dangerous thing. Relief. The vows began. "That coffee will not pour itself," Pearl said quietly. She gave him her hand. He slid the ring on. Her thumb crossed her ring finger one final time, looking for the absence, and met instead the small gold weight of a promise she had not, until that moment, allowed herself to want. She closed her fingers around his for one count longer than the script required. She felt, under the lapel above his pocket, something faint and dry and rhythmic, like a small, living thing. She did not, at the time, name it. She filed it, the way she filed everything, for later. Pearl, who had been holding doors at the Crown Estate since before the bride had been born, watched the groom from the corner of the conservatory and revised her opinion of him a small degree downward, and then, half an hour later, by a small degree back up. "Hold the door," Pearl said under her breath. The wedding breakfast had been moved out onto the south terrace, which Pearl had advised against on grounds of wind, and which Catherine Crown would have advised against on grounds of light. The thing was, now that Catherine had been dead for 14 years, and there was no one in the Crown household, including Edward, who would admit to remembering what Catherine would have advised. And so the table had gone out onto the terrace, and the wind was lifting the corners of the linen the way the wind lifted the corners of linen on the terrace every March. And the photographers were standing in the wrong place, and Pearl, who had brought the second silver coffee pot out herself, rather than ask one of the girls to do it twice, set the pot down at the end of the long table and let her gaze settle on the new husband. He was the wrong cut. She did not mean his suit. The suit was good. It was, in fact, the suit of a man who had taken advice from a person who knew what suits did at March light on a Hudson estate. She meant the way his shoulders sat inside the suit, the way his hands sat on the cloth of his trousers when he sat down. He had not been raised in this kind of room. He had learned this kind of room, and he had learned it well. Well enough that anyone in the room who had also learned it would not catch him at it. But Pearl, who had spent 40 years watching people sit in this room, caught him at it in the second minute. The way he set down his fork between bites, the way he waited a fraction of a beat too long before lifting his glass, the way he positioned the small, expensive cufflink at his wrist when he thought no one was looking. Working man, Pearl thought, without judgment and without warmth. Then she watched him with the bride, and she revised it. He was looking at Margot the way Margot had not been looked at by anyone with money in this house, possibly ever. The previous man, the one whose engagement had quietly ended 5 years ago, and whose name was not used in the house anymore, had looked at her like a portfolio. Edward looked at her like a project. The men who came to dinner looked at her like a daughter. This one, Pearl thought, watching Daniel Hawthorne hand his bride a small glass of orange juice with the careful, exact, two-handed attention of a man passing a candle, looked at her like a woman. Which was, Pearl set the coffee pot down a little harder than she had intended, interesting. Margot took the glass. She did not, Pearl noted, do the small, automatic smile she did for everyone else. She did the smaller, less photogenic, more private one that Pearl had not seen on her since she was 16. Pearl filed that, too. "Coffee, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The name landed at the table without warning. Margot's hand did not move. The hand on the orange juice tightened, by a margin only Pearl saw. And then the bride lifted her face with the well-trained calm of a woman who had been told her father had bought a new building, and turned to Pearl, as if Pearl had said anything at all reasonable, and said, "Yes, please." Daniel, beside her, had turned his head a fraction. The set of his jaw had altered. The new name, on his new wife, in this room, had done something to him that Pearl could not, in 3 seconds, quite name. She would name it later. She had 30 years of naming Crown husbands later. This one she set down on a shelf, next to relief, and beside something that was almost regret, which made no sense, and so she did not yet trust it. She poured the coffee. "And for you, sir." "Black," Daniel said. "Thank you." He looked at her when he said it. This was, Pearl noted, an unusual thing for a Crown in-law to do. Crown husbands, in her experience, did not so much look at the housekeeper as look through her in the direction of the housekeeper's task. Daniel Hawthorne looked at her, briefly, properly, the way a man who had at some point in his life been on the other side of a tray looked at the person who was holding one. And Pearl, who did not approve of being charmed by manners, was very nearly charmed by manners. She moved on around the table. She was at the end of the terrace when the foreman friend cornered her. He was, she had been informed by the seating chart, named Tobias Reed. He was a broad man in a slightly too tight jacket, with the alert, open, working-day face of a man who had not yet noticed that the photographer at the far end of the lawn was a professional and not a wedding guest. And he stopped Pearl with a hand half lifted and the kind of polite, slightly desperate smile of a person trying not to break a glass. "Excuse me, ma'am, listen, these little spoons, are they for the eggs or the jam, do you reckon?" Pearl looked at the spoons. "The jam," she said. "Right," Tobias said. "Right. See? I told him." He shook his head. "Listen, he's gone proper posh today, hasn't he? You wouldn't know to look at him. I've seen this man wipe his nose on a Tyvek sleeve, on a roof, in February, swearing at me about a chimney flashing. And here he is, handing over an orange juice like a... what's the word? Like a sommelier." Pearl did not change her face. She'd not changed her face when Edward Crown had bought his second yacht in 1989, and she did not change her face now. "A foreman, was he?" she said. "For years," Tobias said, in the proud, slightly aggrieved tone of a man who had not been informed that this was confidential. "Started out 12, 13 years old on his dad's crew. Picked it up the hard way. Did the night classes. Built that little firm of his with 2 laptops and a Honda. Then the suits came in and... oh." He stopped. The eyes of a man who has noticed the photographer arrived on his face, about 3 seconds late. "I shouldn't have said that," Tobias said quietly. "No," Pearl said gently. "Probably not. But I am not the press. And your friend is now, frankly, more married than he was an hour ago. And any house that needs a husband to keep his history neatly folded in a drawer is not a house worth being married into. Eat the eggs. The spoons are for the Jan." She moved past him. At the head of the table, Edward Crown had risen. He did not, as a rule, give speeches. He had given precisely 4 speeches in his daughter's life that Pearl could count. At her christening, at her 16th, at her mother's funeral, and at the gala the year the foundation had broken 8 figures. He gave the 5th one now, with his hands resting on the back of the chair he had been sitting in, and his Wall Street Journal still folded under it on the flagstones, as if the speech were a small, unscheduled item between meetings. "Daniel," he said. The terrace went still. Even the wind briefly conceded. "You are now, in the eyes of the law and of this family, my son-in-law. I will give you, in the spirit of the day, exactly 1 piece of advice. My daughter is, as you may have noticed, not a person who is easily surprised. The man who manages to surprise her in a way she enjoys becomes, over time, a person she will protect. This is a rare thing. Try not to waste it." He raised his glass. He did not look at Daniel. He looked, with the same careful, contained, slightly draughty face he had used at the back of the chapel, at Margot. "To my daughter," he said, "and to her husband." Glasses lifted. Pearl, holding the silver coffee pot at the end of the table, watched the new husband try to drink his orange juice with a hand that had gone, for one small, unprofessional second, unsteady. And she thought, with the slow, unwilling recognition of a person who has been wrong about people in this house once before, and does not intend to be wrong again. He did not come here for her. She put the pot down on the warming plate. But he is going to leave here because of her, she thought, and she did not yet know whether that was a sentence she was going to be glad of or sorry for. And so she did the only sensible thing a housekeeper can do at a wedding breakfast on a Hudson terrace in March. She took the second tray of pastries around herself, so that the girls, who were watching, would not have to manage the kind of weather that was beginning to gather around the head of the table. The apartment, the next morning, was very quiet. Margot woke at 6, in the unfamiliar position of a person who had slept all the way through to 6, and was now alone in a bed that did not yet, properly, smell of 2 people. The other side was made. She put her hand on the cool sheet for half a second longer than she needed to confirm the fact, and then she got up. She put on his shirt over her camisole because it was nearest, and because her own dressing gown was still in the dressing room at her father's house. She walked barefoot down the long corridor of the Crown Manhattan apartment, in the small, slightly unbalanced way of a woman who had been on her feet in heels for 9 hours the day before, and she stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, because Daniel Hawthorne was already in it. He had made coffee. He was at the Marble Island in last night's trousers and a clean grey t-shirt, with his hair still damp from a shower she had not heard, and he was holding a small bag of coffee beans in one hand and a small electric grinder in the other, and he was looking at the grinder with the careful, slightly affronted expression of a man who had inherited, by marriage, a kitchen full of objects that were more expensive than any one object in a kitchen needed to be. He looked up. His face did the small, unguarded thing it had done at the altar, briefly, and then it composed. "Morning," he said. Margot said, and stepped onto the cool tile with the small interior wince of bare feet on marble. "You found the grinder?" "I found 6 grinders," he said. "3 of them are jugs," she said. He paused. He turned the object in his hand. He examined it from a new angle. He nodded once, very slightly, in the way a man who had spent a long time on construction sites nodded, when a piece of equipment turned out to be doing a job other than the one he had assumed it was doing. "Right," he said. "And which one is the grinder?" "The black one, top left." "Of course," he said. She came around the island. She took the small black grinder down off its shelf. She handed it to him. Their fingers touched for one accidental count, and she withdrew her hand the way she withdrew her hand from any contact she had not herself initiated. And she walked around to the far side of the island and put the marble between them, and folded her arms in his shirt, and said, with the small, gentle, self-deprecating laugh she had been deploying in awkward kitchens since she was 12, "You poor thing. Welcome to the Crown Kitchen. There's a manual for the toaster. I'll find it." It came out, she heard a second too late, as exactly the wrong sentence. Daniel's hands, on the grinder, slowed. He did not look up. He poured the beans. He pressed the lid. The grinder made its short, expensive, almost inaudible noise. He measured. He tamped. He set the mocha pot, the one item in the kitchen that was his, and that he had carried in his duffel bag the night before, on the gas. And he lit the gas, and the small blue flame leapt into the steel. "Right," he said, eventually, mildly. "I'll have a read." "I didn't mean," Margot began. "It's fine," Daniel said. It was not fine. She knew it was not fine in the way she knew her father's Simons's. She had spent 28 years reading the temperature of a particular kind of male jaw. She watched his jaw, in the small kitchen light, and she catalogued what she had just done. She had been raised in a kitchen where no one had ever touched a grinder, because there had always been someone whose job it was to touch a grinder. She had walked into her own kitchen on the morning after her wedding, and she had stood, barefoot, in her new husband's shirt, and she had patronized him about a coffee bean. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he was sliding a small espresso cup across the marble toward her. "There," he said. "Don't tell anyone I made you that with the wrong grinder." She laughed. It was a small, surprised, off-script laugh, and his face did the unguarded thing again for half a second, and she thought, with the bright, unwelcome interior clarity of a woman who had spent the last 12 hours filing the previous day under the heading of arrangement, and not under the heading of marriage. Oh no. She lifted the cup. She drank. The coffee was very good. It was the precise temperature, the precise strength, the precise tiny crust of crema at the rim, that a man who had been making coffee on construction sites since he was 16 knew how to extract from any machine, in any kitchen, on any morning, in any house. She set the cup down. She did not, immediately, find a sentence. He did. He was the one who broke it. "I'm going to need to know," he said, looking past her at the window where the New York morning was beginning to fill the kitchen in the small, flat plains of a Manhattan March. "What you actually drink in the morning." She looked at him. "Not what you let the people who have made you coffee for 28 years assume you drink," he said. "What you drink. What you would drink if no one was watching." Margot looked at him. It was not a question her last husband, who had not been a husband, had ever asked her. It was not a question her father had ever asked her. It was, on the morning after her wedding, in a kitchen she had thought she knew, In a marriage she had agreed to for reasons that had seemed sufficient at the time, and were beginning, 20 hours in, to seem astonishing. The first question she could remember being asked in this apartment in a year. She thought. "Black tea," she said eventually, "with a great deal too much sugar. The kind in the boxes in train stations. I have not had it since I was 15 because Pearl, who loves me, does not believe in it." Daniel nodded once. He turned back to the grinder. He set it down. He put the bag of beans, almost ceremonially, on the marble. He reached, on his own initiative, into the cabinet over the kettle that contained the formal teas Pearl had laid in for them as a wedding gift, and he removed from it, without looking, the small red box of supermarket tea bags he had, evidently, brought in his duffel. "I had a feeling," he said. Margot, in her husband's shirt, in her father's apartment, in the small, unfamiliar light of the morning after her wedding, put both hands flat on the marble and looked at the small red box. And she did not say anything for a long time. When she did, it was very quiet. "Thank you," she said. "I am thinking," he said. He boiled the kettle. The day began. The first week of being married to a stranger was a curriculum in noticing. Margot had thought of cohabitation, in the abstract, as a matter of logistics. Which closets, which side of the bed, whose dry cleaner. The logistics took, in the event, about 40 minutes. What no one had warned her about was the steady, low-grade education of the body in the small accidental habits of another body. The way he set his keys, every evening, in the small porcelain bowl by the door, and then, on the third evening, the way he hesitated half a second, looked at the bowl, looked at her, and set the keys in it more quietly. The way he ate standing up at the counter, the first night, until she sat down at the table, and the next night, he sat down at the table without her having to ask. And on the third night, he was at the table already when she came in. The way he never, in any moment that she observed, dropped his coat on a chair. She, on her side, was a more difficult student. She had been managed by professionals since she was 11. She had not lived with anyone since she was 22, and that had been 3 months in a Tribeca apartment with a man who, it turned out, had been using the second bathroom as an office for someone she had never met. She had developed, in the years since, the small unconscious geography of a woman who lived alone. She left her shoes in the doorway. She left her phone face down on whatever surface was nearest. She left half-drunk glasses of water on the windowsill, on the bookcase, on the rim of the bathtub, in places she had to come back and rescue at 3 a.m. when she remembered them. Daniel, on the fourth night, brought her a glass of water from the windowsill in the living room, as she was sitting up in bed reading. "You left this," he said. "I thought you'd want it where you can find it." He set it on her nightstand. He did not stay. Margot looked at the glass for a long time. The next morning, she found her phone, face down, on her nightstand, and she did not at first remember placing it there. And then she remembered, with the slow accuracy of a woman who had been trying not to remember, that she had not placed it there. He had. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. By the end of the second week, the glasses had stopped appearing on the windowsill, and the phone had begun to arrive nightly on the nightstand, and her shoes, when she dropped them in the doorway, were, by morning, paired against the wall, and she had taken to leaving Daniel's work boots exactly where he set them down, because she did not, she discovered, want to be the kind of wife who tidied a man's boots into a closet on the second week of a marriage. He noticed the boots. He did not comment. On the morning of the third Saturday, she came into the kitchen to make tea, and found his old grey crewneck sweater folded on the back of one of the bar stools. It was the sweater he wore when he was reading. It had a small dark patch on the right cuff. That, she had learned by then, was coffee from a job site in Long Island the previous year. The kitchen was very cold. The radiator in the corner had developed, in the second week, an unstable relationship with the boiler that the building superintendent had promised, twice now, to attend to. Margot stood barefoot on the cool tile, in her thin pajamas, and looked at the sweater for 1 full minute. "Steady," Daniel said, quietly, to no one. She put it on. It came down to mid-thigh on her. It smelled, slightly, of the cedar wardrobe he kept his clothes in at the back of the dressing room. It smelled, more faintly, of the mocha pot and of a particular soap he used that she had not yet asked him about. It was, on her body, in her kitchen, in her father's apartment, in the cold of a Manhattan March, the warmest object she had touched in 15 years. She made the tea. She was halfway through it when he came in. He stopped at the threshold. He was in a clean white shirt and trousers, ready for a Saturday meeting with a client at a hotel in Midtown, with his coat over his arm. He had not, evidently, expected her to be in the kitchen yet. He had not, equally evidently, expected her to be in the kitchen in his sweater. Carefully now, Daniel said to himself. His face did the unguarded thing for a third time. She was, by now, beginning to recognize it. She set the cup down. She lifted both hands very slightly from her sides. She said, "I'm cold. The radiator's wrong. I am wearing your sweater. I am willing to give it back if it is, in any meaningful way, your favorite sweater." Daniel set his coat over the back of the chair he had begun, in the second week, to use. "It is, in every meaningful way, my favorite sweater," he said. She moved to take it off. "And," he said, "you should keep it on." She stopped. He came to the counter. He did not touch her. He poured himself, from the pot she had made, a cup of black tea with a great deal too much sugar, in the small ritual that had become, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, theirs. He held the cup against his palm. He looked at her over the rim. His eyes were a quieter color than she had given them credit for at the rehearsal. "That sweater," he said, "has had a long, bad life on rooftops. It deserves a kitchen in Manhattan, and a woman who is reading the Saturday paper." "I am not, technically, reading the paper." "You are about to," he said. "I can see the paper on the counter. The paper is 2 feet from your hand. You are going to drink your tea, and then you are going to read the paper. I have observed." "You have observed," she said. "I am a foreman," he said. "It is the job." She looked at him. He had said it lightly. Tobias's words at the wedding breakfast. "I've seen this man wipe his nose on a Tyvek sleeve on a roof in February," landed on her again in the cold kitchen, with the small, precise weight of a thing she had not, until this moment, decided to use. She had spent 12 days not asking. Pearl, in the only conversation Pearl had permitted herself with Margot on the subject of the marriage, had said, with the dry, careful neutrality of a woman who had decided not to interfere, "Your husband, my dear, came up through chimneys. I would not have minded knowing that before the dress was on." Margot had not asked Daniel about chimneys. She had not, in 12 days, asked Daniel about any of the things she did not yet know about him. She decided to ask one. "Were you," she said, "a foreman?" He set the cup down. He did not pretend not to know what she was asking. "For 9 years," he said. "Started on my dad's crew. Did the night classes for the rest. Started the firm when I was 26. 12 people now, 3 offices. Good books." "My father," she said carefully, "did not tell me that." "Your father," Daniel said, "does not, in my limited experience, tell you anything he does not believe will be useful to you in the next quarter." She blinked. "That is," she said, "the most accurate sentence anyone has said about my father in this apartment in 9 years. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. She held the sweater closed at the throat. The radiator, in the corner, ticked once, then resumed its uneven, slightly insulted breathing. Her phone, on the counter, lit briefly with a message from the Foundation office that, she could tell at a glance, was a logistical question about Monday's lunch, and could wait until 10. She let it wait. She drank her tea. She watched Daniel Hawthorne, in his clean white shirt, on a Saturday morning in her father's kitchen, in a marriage she did not yet understand the rules of, fold his coat over his arm, and lift his cup, and look at her over the rim, with the small, contained attention of a man who was, very carefully, not pressing his advantage. He set his cup down. He came around the counter. He did not, even now, touch her. He stopped a half-pace away. He looked, briefly, and the small dark patch on the right cuff of his sweater, the coffee from Long Island, and he said, very quietly, "Margot." "Yes," she said. It was the first time he had used her name in the kitchen. "I have a meeting at the Carlisle in 40 minutes, he said. "I'm going to leave. I'm going to come back at 3. If the sweater is, by 3, on the back of the chair, I will know one thing. If it is, by 3, still on you, I will know a different thing. I'm not asking which." "I am thinking," she said. He nodded once, the small foreman nod, and he picked up his coat, and he went. The door closed. The radiator in the corner gave up. The boiler in the basement, 3 floors down, made the small, disgusted clanking noise it made when it was offended. Margot stood, in her husband's sweater, in her father's kitchen, on a Saturday in March, and she put both hands flat on the counter, and she looked at the small, dark patch on the cuff, and she thought, with the bright, unwelcome clarity of a woman who had not allowed herself to want a thing in 5 years. "I want him to come back at 3, she said, to no one. She picked up her phone. She answered the question about Monday's lunch. She made an entirely separate, more difficult, more interior decision, the way she made all such decisions, by half degrees, over the rim of a teacup. At 3, when she heard his key in the door, the sweater was still on her, and she did not get up from the chair to meet him. He came into the kitchen. He saw the sweater. He set down his bag. He did not, even now, say anything. He sat in the chair beside her, with his coat still on, and he put his hand, palm up, on the table between them, without looking at her, like a man laying down a single tool he was not sure she would need. She put her hand in his. She did not, in the cold kitchen on the cold Saturday in March, take it back. The press lunch on the following Tuesday was, as Pearl observed in the long carpeted corridor outside the press room of the Crown Hotel in Midtown, the sort of event a sensible person would, frankly, have moved indoors. It was, in fact, indoors. Pearl had not been invited. She had come anyway, in her good navy suit, with the small, contained dignity of a woman who had been at every difficult Crown Foundation function since 1989 and had no intention of stopping at this one. She was carrying, in her left hand, a folded silk square Margot had left in the morning rush and would, by 12:30, need. In her right, she was carrying the small, considered list of questions Margot had asked her to memorize, in case they were asked by anyone Pearl had time to discourage. The corridor smelled of the particular industrial floral hotel scent that Pearl had complained about, in private, for 30 years. Margot, beside her, walked the way she walked into press, half a beat slower than her own pace, weight balanced through the heel, eyes on the middle distance. Daniel walked on her other side, in a navy suit and a tie the color of a colder kind of bronze. He had not, in 8 weeks of marriage, attended a Crown Foundation press event before. He looked, Pearl thought, less alarmed than she would have expected. He looked, in fact, like a man who had been on enough sites to recognize weather, and who had decided that this was weather, and that the weather was going to do what weather did, and that the only useful response was to keep walking. At the door, Pearl held back. "My dear," she said to Margot, very quietly, "it is going to be the housing question." "I know," Margot said. "And the donor." "I know. And, frankly," Pearl said, allowing herself, for once, the word that belonged to Edward, "your father has not slept. He came down at 4. He was in the conservatory, looking at the silver frame again. I suspect today is the anniversary of something he is not going to tell either of us about. He will be useless on the panel." "I know," Margot said. She did not turn her head. She did the small, dignified elbow gesture she did for Pearl when she did not want a witness to see her hold her hand. Pearl, who knew the gesture, took the silk square and pressed it into Margot's palm. "Go and earn your name," Pearl said. "And that is meant to make me feel better, is it?" Margot murmured, smiling without moving her face. "It is meant to make you feel honest," Pearl said, "which, in my experience, is the only thing that ever has." She squeezed once and let her go. The doors opened. The press room was full. Daniel, beside Margot, took the seat at the very back that the Foundation's communications director had reserved for him, with a small handwritten card. Edward sat at the long table at the front, in the chair he always sat in, with his hands folded and his Wall Street Journal nowhere visible, which Pearl, watching from the door, considered a bad sign. Margot took the central microphone. She gave the Foundation's prepared statement. She gave it well. She gave it in the warm, dignified, slightly faster than natural cadence of a woman who had given a great many such statements, and knew exactly how many seconds were left in the slot. She introduced the new community housing initiative. She introduced the lead architect. She introduced the partner organizations. She did not introduce, because the Foundation had not, as of 7 in the morning, been able to confirm whether to introduce the lead corporate sponsor. The room knew it. The room had known it since 9. The questions opened. The first was the housing question. Margot answered it cleanly. The second was the timeline. She answered that one. The third was the donor. It came from the front row. It came from a thin, polite, well-dressed man in his late 30s, whose name Pearl knew and did not respect. Ms. Crown, Mrs. Hawthorne, I beg your pardon. There is a story circulating this morning, you may have heard, that the lead sponsor for the housing initiative has, reconsidered their commitment. Can you confirm or deny? Edward's hands, at the table, tightened a 1/4 inch. Margot's did not move. I can confirm, she said. The room rustled. Daniel, in the back row, did not move. As of 7 this morning, Margot said, in the same warm, even, slightly faster cadence, our lead corporate sponsor for the housing initiative withdrew. We are restructuring the initiative's funding stack today and into the rest of this week. The construction timeline is unaffected for the first phase. The second phase will move. The partner organizations are not at risk. We will hold a further press briefing on Friday with revised numbers. Ta, she said. The polite, well-dressed man in the front row leaned in. And Mrs. Hawthorne. Given that you are now married into the Hawthorne firm, which has, of course, a great deal of construction experience, can the public expect that your new husband's firm will be replacing, shall we say, the previous corporate partner? The room went still. It went still the way a room went still in the half-second before a verdict. Daniel, in the back row, did not move. He did not, Pearl observed from the door, change his face. He did not, in fact, do any of the things that a husband who had been publicly accused, in front of a press pool, of having married for access, might reasonably have been expected to do. He sat with his hands folded on his thighs and his eyes on his wife, and he absorbed it. It was, Pearl thought, with the slow, appalled clarity of a woman who had been at a great many press events, the most difficult thing she had ever watched a man do in this hotel. Edward Crown, at the long table, did not save her. He did not say what he could have said. He did not say, the Hawthorne firm has not been considered, will not be considered, and that suggestion is unbecoming. He sat with his hands folded, and his eyes on a point about 3 feet above the polite, well-dressed man's head, and he said nothing. And Pearl, who had been watching Edward Crown in difficult rooms for 30 years, understood for the first time in her tenure that Edward Crown, at this moment, on this morning, on the anniversary of whatever it was he was not going to tell either of them about, was not capable of speaking. Margot saw it. She did not look at her father. That is not how the Foundation makes procurement decisions, Margot said, quietly, into the central microphone. And it will not be how the Foundation makes procurement decisions for this initiative. My husband's firm has been informed in writing this morning that it is not eligible to bid on Phase 2. Next question. The room did not, for one full count, breathe. Then it broke. Hands went up. The communications director, on the side, stepped forward. The polite, well-dressed man sat back. Edward Crown, at the long table, lifted his chin a fraction of an inch in the small, contained gesture of a man who was acknowledging, without saying so, that he had been carried. Margot took the next question. In the back row, Daniel Hawthorne did not, even now, move. Pearl, from the door, found that she had to. She went up the long corridor to the small private staff lounge where Edward, after press, always went for 10 minutes alone. She let herself in with the key Edward did not know she had. She set the silk square Margot had not, in the end, needed on the small side table by the window. She stood for a long count in the quiet room, with the carpet that smelled of the wrong floral and the small framed photograph of Catherine on the mantel that Edward, every year on this morning, sent down ahead of him. She did not touch the photograph. "Mind the linen," Pearl said, half to no one. She left, as she had come in, by the staff stair. 20 minutes later, Edward Crown would come into that room and stand at that mantel and put his thumb against the silver frame and rub it, very gently, the way a man rubs at dust he cannot quite see. And no one would witness him do it, because Pearl, who had loved his wife and who loved his daughter, and who had, today, watched his daughter carry him, had left first. She did not, on the staff stair, allow herself to cry. She had given that up at his wife's funeral. She had not, since, taken it back. In the press room, Margot was answering the next question. "That coffee will not pour itself," Pearl said quietly. In the back row, her husband was beginning, very slowly, to understand. The board call on Wednesday morning ran over by 90 minutes, and Margot took it from the small spare office 2 floors below the Foundation's main suite, because the main suite was full of reporters who had not, 24 hours after the press lunch, gone home. She had not, after the press lunch, spoken to her father. She had spoken to him about Wednesday, which was not the same thing. She had told him, in the corridor, that she would chair the emergency board call alone. He had not argued. He had looked at her, in the small, contained way he looked at her when he had a sentence he was not going to say, and he had said only, "I would like, if you can spare 20 minutes on Friday, to ask you about something at the house." She had said yes, and she had walked out of the corridor, and she had spent the rest of Tuesday and the whole of Tuesday night in the small spare office 2 floors below the suite, with the spreadsheet of the Housing Initiative's restructured funding stack on one screen, and her grandmother's diary open at a particular page on the other. Catherine had given her the diary at 13, Catherine had said, with the half-smile she did when she was saying a thing she meant and pretending not to. "If you are going to be a crown in any room, my darling, you will need somewhere to put the part of you that isn't." "Hold the door," Pearl said, under her breath. Margot had not opened the diary in 8 months. She opened it on Tuesday night because it was the only object in the spare office that had not been bought to perform the Foundation's work, and because she needed, for 1 private hour at midnight, to put the part of her that wasn't a crown somewhere it could not be subpoenaed. She wrote 3 pages. She wrote about a kitchen in March. She wrote about a sweater. She did not write his name. She wrote in the last line, "I do not yet know what I have done. I know that I do not, this morning, want to undo it. That, today, is what I have to be honest about." She closed the diary at 1. She slept on the office sofa for 4 hours. The Wednesday call opened at 7. Pearl, who did not under any circumstances attend Foundation board calls, was nevertheless, by 7:30, in the small spare office with a fresh pot of coffee and a small plate of buttered toast, which she set on the desk without comment, and which Margot, in the 3rd hour of the call, ate without realizing. Daniel had not been told the call was happening. He had left at 6 for a job site in Brooklyn. The marriage had developed, in 8 weeks, the small, unspoken protocol of professional non-interference. They did not discuss the Foundation's procurement decisions over breakfast, and he did not discuss the Hawthorne firm's bid pipeline over dinner. And the protocol had been adequate, until Tuesday's question in the front row, and now the protocol was not adequate, and they had not yet, either of them, found a sentence to replace it with. Margot chaired the call. "The light is wrong on that table," Pearl said quietly. She put the donor question first. She did not, as her father would have done, defer it to the end. She said, with the warm, even cadence she had used at the press, that the lead sponsor had withdrawn, for reasons she would not, on this call, speculate about, and that the Foundation's responsibility was now to the partner organizations and the construction timeline, and the residents who had been promised first-phase units in October. She invited each of the 11 trustees, in turn, by name, to speak. She listened to all of them. She wrote down, in pencil, in the back of Catherine's diary, the small, private notes she did not want anyone else to see. At the second hour, the eldest trustee, who had been on the board since 1991 and had voted against Margot's appointment as director 4 years ago, cleared his throat. "My dear," he said, "we are going to have to ask. Is your husband's firm going to be part of the answer here?" Margot did not, at first, answer. She looked at the door. Pearl, in the doorway, did not move. She looked, then, at the page of the diary in front of her, and the small line in pencil, "Will be terrible at brunch," that she had written on Sunday morning in the small brownstone they had begun, 3 weekends in a row now, to rent on a Saturday so that they could be, for 36 hours at a time, 2 people whose name was not on the building. She closed the diary. "No," she said into the phone. The silence on the call was not, this time, the silence of a verdict. It was the silence of a board of trustees who had not, in any of them, expected the answer to be that simple, that flat, that early. "My husband's firm," Margot said, "is excellent." She said, "It is also, for the duration of my chairmanship, ineligible. I will be putting that in writing to the procurement committee this morning." "And the replacement?" a trustee said. "The replacement sponsor will be found by Friday," Margot said. "I have, last night, made the first 3 calls. I will be making the next 9 today." "What do you need from us?" "I am asking you individually to make the calls in the document I am sending to your inboxes in the next 2 minutes," she said. She let the line go quiet a moment. "If anyone on this call is not willing to make those calls because of what was implied yesterday by a reporter who, frankly, was not asking a question about housing, I would like you to say so now." She waited. No one said so. The eldest trustee, who had voted against her in 2022, cleared his throat a second time. "Send the list, my dear," he said. The call ran another 40 minutes, and then it ended, and Margot put the phone face down on the desk and put both hands flat on Catherine's diary and held them there for one long count. Pearl, in the doorway, said, "Your father is in the corridor." "I hear you," Margot said, not looking up. "How long has he been there?" "Since the donor question." "How much did he hear?" "All of it." Margot lifted her face. Edward was in the corridor in his charcoal suit, with his hands in his pockets, which he did not do, and the small, contained, drafty face he had worn at the back of the chapel, which he had worn rather a lot in the last 8 weeks. And he looked at his daughter through the open doorway of the small spare office for one long count. And he did the small, unprofessional thing he had not done in a public corridor in any year of Margot's life that she could remember. He stepped into the office. He did not sit. He stood inside the doorway. He looked at the plate of buttered toast, the half-empty coffee pot, the diary open at the back, at the 11 pencil notes she had not finished. And he said, very quietly, "That was your mother's chair, you know. The desk, too. We put her in this office in the year before the diagnosis because she could not bear the suite upstairs. She said the carpet up there smelled like a hospital, even before there was a reason for it to." Margot said. "I did not know," she said. "No," Edward said. "I did not tell you." He looked briefly at the diary. He did not, even now, reach for it. He looked back at his daughter, and he did the smallest of the small, contained things his face was capable of. And he said, "On Friday, at the house, please. 20 minutes. There is something I have allowed to go on too long." Margot, who had been about to say, "Of course," did not say it. She looked at her father. "All right," she said instead. He nodded once. He withdrew, very quietly, into the corridor. Pearl, in the doorway, watched him go. She did not turn back to Margot for one full count, and when she did, the small, dry face she usually wore was, for a moment, not quite the face she usually wore. "Eat the toast," Pearl said finally. "You will need it." She closed the door. In the back row of every room, Daniel Hawthorne, who had not been on the call and would not, until that Friday evening, know it had happened, was beginning to keep, with the small, accurate carpenter's eye of a man who had measured things for 20 years, a different kind of running tally. Of his wife, of her father, of the small, dark patch on the cuff of a sweater she had not, since Saturday, taken off in the evenings, of a folder at the back of his desk drawer in the small brownstone he had begun to think of as theirs, which contained a set of photocopied papers from 2006 that he had not, since the morning of the wedding, opened. The folder, he had realized on Wednesday night when he came home and found her asleep in his sweater on the brownstone sofa with the diary on her chest, was beginning to feel less like an asset and more like a weight. "And that is meant to fix it, is it?" Pearl murmured to herself. On Sunday morning, the brownstone was warm. It was the first proper warm morning of the year. The radiator that had broken in the Manhattan apartment was, in this small rented house in Brooklyn, 2 blocks from a bakery he had begun to walk to, replaced by a single old cast-iron stove that Daniel had cleaned with a rag and a tin of polish on the second Saturday of their tenancy, and that now, with a small split log of cherry wood crackling in it, was doing the unfussy job that radiators in Manhattan rented for $40,000 a month had spent 8 weeks failing to do. Margot was at the small round table in the kitchen, in his sweater and a pair of his thick wool socks. She was reading, with the small, focused frown she did when she was reading something she did not entirely approve of, the Sunday paper. She was drinking the supermarket tea with a great deal too much sugar that he had, on Tuesday, brought home another box of. She had not, since Tuesday, said the words "thank you" about it. She had instead, on Friday morning, set on his bedside table the small box of expensive, single-origin coffee beans he had been buying since he was 26 and had not been able to afford in the Manhattan kitchen, because Pearl, who loved Margot, had assumed they would prefer the house brand. "I found these at the place on Atlantic," she had said, without looking at him. "They had the kind you like." He had said "thank you" about the beans. She had said "don't." He came into the kitchen with the brown paper bag from the bakery. "Bread," he said. "Bread," she said, without looking up. He set the bag on the table. He took down from the open shelf the small wooden board they had bought together at a flea market on the 3rd Sunday. He took the bread out. He cut it. He put the cut bread on the board. He took out the small jar of jam Pearl had sent over with a note saying, "Do not, my dear, embarrass me by serving him supermarket jam in your own kitchen." And he set it on the table, and he sat down across from his wife in the warm, small kitchen, and watched her drink her tea. She looked up. She looked at the bread. She looked at the jam. She looked, briefly, at the small jar of supermarket jam she had bought on Saturday, at the same supermarket where she had once, in her senior year of college, bought a bag of pretzels and been photographed in the parking lot. She looked, then, at him. "That is an unbecoming jar of jam," she said, "and a very becoming loaf of bread." "I have," Daniel said gravely, "what we in the trade call a balanced portfolio." She laughed. It was a small laugh. It had a slightly creaky quality, the way the laugh of a person who has not used a particular laugh in a long time has a creaky quality. And he heard it land in the kitchen, and felt, in the back of his ribs where the watch had been ticking for 2 months, a small, clean, dangerous thing. She did not, in the kitchen, manage him. He did not, in the kitchen, manage her. He spread jam on a piece of bread. He passed it to her. She took it. She ate it. She made the small, private face she made when she ate something she had not expected to enjoy. She passed her cup across the table. He poured her more tea. He put, without looking, the spoon of sugar in it that he knew she did not like to be seen putting in it herself. She closed her fingers around the cup. "We'll be terrible at brunch," she said, with the small, contained certainty of a woman saying a sentence in a tense she had not used about her own life in 5 years. Daniel did not, at once, answer. He looked at her, in his sweater, in his socks, in the warm, small kitchen of a house they did not own and had not yet bought, on a Sunday morning in May, and he thought, with the slow falling clarity of a man who had spent 2 years engineering himself into a position from which he could destroy a family, and who had, in the last 8 weeks, accidentally engineered himself into a position from which he could not destroy anything at all without destroying this. "I cannot do it," he said, to no one. He cleared his throat. "We will be," he said, "famously terrible at brunch. You'll have to wear a tie." "I will wear a tie." "And use a fork." "I will, at some inconvenience, use a fork." "And not flirt with Pearl," he said. "Pearl flirts with me," he said. "Pearl has, since the wedding breakfast, made it her business to wink at me whenever your father is not in the room. I am not the one running that operation, Margot. I am, on a daily basis, on the receiving end of it." Margot, in the warm kitchen, in his sweater, laughed properly. It was the laugh of a woman who had not laughed properly in a kitchen, on a Sunday morning, in a marriage, for as long as she could remember. It was the laugh of a woman who had decided, somewhere between Tuesday and Sunday, that the man across the table from her had earned the right to be looked at without being measured. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 13 years carrying a particular small unhappiness in the back of her ribs, and who had, in the moment of laughing, set it briefly down. Daniel watched it. He sat in his own kitchen, on a Sunday in May, the folder at the back of his desk drawer, in the room above the kitchen, at the back of his interior life, in the place where he had once kept it. And he reached across the table, with the small, two-handed attention of a man passing a candle, and he took her hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She did not, for a long count, take it back. "Mind the linen," Pearl said, half to no one. The cherry wood log in the stove broke, very quietly, into the small white embers underneath it. The kettle, on the back of the stove, made the small, contented sigh of a kettle that had been recently boiled and was no longer needed. Outside the kitchen window, in the small back garden they had not yet, in any week of their tenancy, planted anything in, the sun came in at the angle that meant May. Daniel Hawthorne, in his own kitchen, in a marriage he had begun for the wrong reason, looked at his wife and understood, with the slow, clean certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life carrying a watch that did not, in this kitchen, tick. He was going to have to tell her. Friday came. "That coffee will not pour itself," Pearl said quietly. Edward Crown had asked for 20 minutes at the house. He took, in the event, 11. The conservatory at the Crown estate was, in May, the warmest room in the house. Catherine had had it built in the year before Margot was born. It opened off the south side of the library, through a pair of glass doors, and it looked out on the lawn and on the small herb garden Catherine had planted, and that no one, since 2012, had touched. The orchids she had planted along the long inner wall had been kept alive by Pearl, every year, in the small, contained way Pearl kept things alive in this house when no one had instructed her to. Margot, who had not been in the conservatory in 8 months, came through the glass doors at 4:15 on Friday afternoon, and stopped at the threshold, because her father was in Catherine's chair. He was not in his chair. He was in hers. He had not, in 14 years, sat in that chair in front of his daughter. "Sit down, my dear," he said, very quietly. "Please." She sat. She sat in his chair, opposite, and she put both hands flat on the cool, small marble of the side table between them, the way Catherine had taught her to put her hands, when she wanted to be still. And she did not, at first, speak. She had the small certainty, in the back of her ribs, that the man across from her was about to dismantle a sentence she had been telling herself, in private, for 8 weeks. She did not know which sentence. She had, in the half hour she had spent driving up from Brooklyn, narrowed it down to 4. Edward folded his hands. "I knew," he said. Margot said. "I knew in November of the year before last," he said, "when the Hawthorne firm bid for the Foundation's procurement audit." "Go on," Margot said. "I knew when his name came across my desk that he was the son of a man whose company I bought, in 2006, out of bankruptcy. And I knew, by the December of the year before last, that he had been planning, at that point for several years, to enter this family by way of you. T, she said, after a count. I knew when he sat down at the Foundation Gala in October to be seated next to you, Edward said. I knew when he proposed to you in February. I knew when you accepted. You knew the chapel, she said. I knew the chapel was booked, he said. I knew when the ring was bought. And the morning. I knew, on the morning of your wedding, when I came into the small kitchenette down the hall and asked you, in the closest thing I have ever come in my life to a sincere question, whether you could still postpone. I said no, Margot said. You said no, Edward said. I let it stand. Dot, he said. That was the wrong choice, he said. Margot's hand on the marble did not move. My dear, Edward said, I am sorry. She looked at him. She looked at her father in her mother's chair, in her mother's conservatory, on her mother's afternoon light, and she felt, with the cold, exact, completely unmanageable clarity of a woman who had spent 13 years training herself never to be in this position again, the floor of her interior life give one quiet inch. You let it happen, she said. I let it happen, Edward said. Why? He folded his hands the smaller way he folded them when he was making himself say a thing he had been arranging not to say for a long time. Because I did not, in 2020, tell you about the last one, he said. Go on. And you found out by going to that apartment alone on a Tuesday afternoon in March, he said, and seeing what you saw. I remember, she said. You did not, for 9 months afterward, eat anything that I had not personally watched a doctor put in front of you. I remember that, too. And I told myself, in the years since, that I would never again be the man in a room who knew a thing about your life that you did not, Edward said. So when his name came across my desk in November, I sat with the information for 1 week. And I decided that I would not be that man again. That I would, this time, let you see him for yourself. You used me. I did. You knew he would marry me for revenge, and you let me marry him. I knew, Edward said, very quietly, that if you were going to be married, by anyone, for any reason, you were going to need to be the person in the room who saw it first. You could have told me, she said. I knew you would not believe me if I told you, he said. I knew it would mean nothing to you in 2024, my dear, the way it would have meant nothing to you in 2020. And so I knew you would only know what kind of man he was if you stood next to him at an altar and watched what he did with the room after. She said, after a count. I knew, in November of the year before last, he said, that I would rather you marry him knowing nothing and find out for yourself than that I would, for the second time in your life, be the father in the corridor who had a folder and would not show it to you. He looked at her. He looked at her across the small, cool marble of her mother's side table, in her mother's conservatory, in her mother's chair. And he did, for the first and last time in his daughter's adult life, the small, impossible thing he had been refusing to do since 2012. He asked, My dear, Edward Crown said, have I, today, again failed you? I am listening, Margot said. She rose. She rose with the small, dignified elbow gesture she did when she did not want a witness to see her hold a hand. She did not, this time, take her father's. She did not look at the orchids on the long inner wall. She did not look at her mother's chair, which her father had vacated for her this afternoon, and would not, she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had watched her mother die and her engagement collapse in the same decade, ever sit in again. She walked out of the conservatory through the glass doors. She walked down the long carpeted corridor past the library and past the small staff stair and past the kitchenette she had stood barefoot in on the morning of her wedding. She did not run. She did not, even now, Hurry. She walked at the half-beat slower pace of a crown in any room, weight balanced through the heel, eyes on the middle distance, and she went down the front steps and across the gravel and got into her car and drove the 48 minutes to the small brownstone in Brooklyn at exactly the speed limit. The brownstone was empty. Daniel was in Midtown until 7. Margot stood in the small kitchen in her coat for 1 full minute. "Carefully now," Edward said, half to himself. She thought, with the clear, declarative interior voice of a woman in the lowest moment of her own adult life. Maybe my husband has never once, in 8 weeks of marriage, looked at me without measuring what I was worth to him in $2,006. Maybe the man who slid the ring on my finger in March, in a chapel my mother had once been married in, has spent every morning of my marriage drinking the tea I drink, and noticing the boots I do not move, and folding the phone I leave face down on the wrong table, for the sole purpose of building, in a folder at the back of his desk drawer, a more complete dossier on my father. She thought it. She let herself, in the cold, small kitchen, in his sweater, in her coat, think the worst possible thing about the man she had laughed with on Sunday morning over a jar of supermarket jam. Then she went upstairs. She packed, in 11 minutes, the small overnight bag she kept under the bed in the dressing room. She left the sweater folded on the chair in the corner where he, on the second weekend, had begun to put his coat. She left, on the small porcelain bowl by the door where he set his keys, the wedding ring. She did not, in the brownstone, leave a note. "The light is wrong on that table," Pearl said quietly. She had nothing, she discovered, as she stood at the door with her hand on the cold brass, that she could put on a single page without, by writing it, making it true. She closed the door. She went, by the long route, to the small studio apartment that Pearl, on the morning after the press lunch, had quietly, without telling anyone, taken a 6-month lease on in her own name, on a quiet street in Cobble Hill, in case it was needed. It was needed. She let herself in. She set the bag on the bed. She did not, in the studio, on the Friday evening, take off her coat. "And that is meant to fix it, is it?" Pearl murmured to herself. Daniel came home to the brownstone at 7:20. The cherry wood in the stove had gone cold. The sweater on the chair in the corner was folded the way she folded things. The wedding ring, in the small porcelain bowl by the door, was where she had set it down. The diary, on the kitchen table, was closed. The Sunday paper was no longer there. There was no note. There did not need to be. Daniel Hawthorne stood, in his own kitchen, in the small brownstone he had begun to call home, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his father's pocket watch, and he held it in his palm, and he listened to it tick, dry and methodical, against his thumb. It said, in the cold kitchen, what it had said for 20 years. "Quietly, my dear," Edward said to no one. He set it down on the kitchen table. He did not, at any point in the long Friday evening, pick it back up. Edward Crown came to the Hawthorne firm's office in the Flatiron Building at 9 on Monday morning, without an appointment. The receptionist, who had been with the firm for 11 months and had been hired the previous summer for, among other reasons, a calm face under pressure, took one look at the man in the camel coat at the small reception counter and put her hand, very carefully, on the small intercom button under the desk, before she said, "Sir, Mr. Hawthorne is not, this morning, expecting—" "He is now," Edward said. He sat in the small chair by the window, with his coat folded on his lap, and he opened the Wall Street Journal, and he waited. Daniel came out of his office in his shirt sleeves. He had not, since Friday, slept. He had not, since Friday, shaved. He had been in his office since 5 on Monday morning, because the brownstone was, this week, a room he could not be in alone, and the Manhattan apartment was a room he was no longer welcome in, and the small studio Margot was sleeping in he did not have the address of, and the only door in the city he had a key to, which would not, when he opened it, make him sick to his stomach, was the door of his own firm. He looked, at the door of the small reception, at Edward Crown in the camel coat with the Wall Street Journal open on his lap. He did not, for a long count, speak. He thought, with the small carpenter's accuracy of a man who had been sitting up since 5 and had not, in 11 hours, been able to put a single sentence together. This is the man I've spent 2 years arranging to be in a room with, and now he is in a room with me. And I have nothing. "Come in," Daniel said, eventually. Edward folded the paper. He set it on the small reception table, the way he set things on small tables he did not expect to see again. He rose, and he came into Daniel's office, and he sat in the small chair opposite Daniel's desk without being asked, and he put his folded hands on the cool top of the desk, and he looked, briefly, at the closed drawer on Daniel's left. He knew. Daniel understood with the cold accuracy of a man who had been outflanked exactly which drawer. "Frankly," Edward said, "I have not, in the last 10 years, sat down in the office of a man whose firm I am about to underwrite." "Go on," Daniel said. "My terms remain, in such matters, unchanged," Edward said. "My terms today, with the housing initiative in front of my daughter and the press pool currently 3 blocks from this building, are also unchanged." "Go on." "The Hawthorne firm will be replacing the lead corporate sponsor on the second phase," Edward said. "The papers will be on her desk by Friday." "The figure?" "The figure will be, by 10%, generous." "And the story?" "The story will be, by Sunday, that I have, in the small matter of in-laws and procurement, exercised my own judgment, and that my daughter, in the small matter of the chair, has remained at it." "Give me a moment," Daniel said. "I am here," Edward said. "My terms," Edward said, "are not for sale." He let the room hold. "The replacement will happen. You will, at the press briefing on Friday, look uncomfortable. I will, at the press briefing on Friday, look smug. And then?" "The story will, by Sunday morning, run," Edward said. "My daughter will, by Monday, be no longer married, in any practical sense, to a man who has, for 2 years, been arranging the bankruptcy of her father." "And the marriage?" "The marriage will, by the end of the quarter, be quietly annulled," Edward said. "You will, at no point in your life, be in this office again." He said. "This is," he said very quietly, "the most generous offer I will make any man in my lifetime." Daniel said. "I am making it because on Friday afternoon at 4:15, my daughter walked out of her mother's conservatory and did not, on the way to the car, look back," Edward said. And the only sound she made in the corridor was the small sound a crown makes when she is not, in any room, going to cry. He said, "I have heard that sound, in this family, twice. I am not going to hear it a 3rd time on your account." Daniel set his hands flat on the desk. He looked, briefly, at the closed drawer on his left. He thought of the folder inside it, the photocopied papers from 2006, the leveraged buyout, the cross-references to his father's signature on the last page, the page he had kept in his desk drawer in every office he had occupied since he was 26. And he thought of his father at the kitchen table in 2006, with his head in his hands. And he thought, with the slow, clean clarity he had not allowed himself in any room since the morning of the wedding. "My father did not have terms," he said very quietly. He said it. He said it once, quietly, across the cool top of the desk, in the room Edward Crown had not been invited into. He did not, when he said it, raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He did not, in the small foreman gesture he had used at the altar, nod. He said it the way his father had said, in a long-ago kitchen, the only sentence Daniel could remember him saying about the buyout. "You do what you can with what they leave you, son." They did not, in the end, leave me much. Edward Crown, in the camel coat, did not, for one full count, breathe. He rose. He stood for a long second in front of the desk. He did not pick up his coat. He did not reach for the journal he had left on the reception table. He did not, even now, ask the question he had asked his daughter in the conservatory. Because Edward Crown was a man who had asked that question once in his life, and had not survived the answer, and was not, today, going to ask it again. "I will," Edward said. "Consider what you have said." He walked out of the office. He retrieved the journal from the reception table on the way past. He inclined his head, a quarter inch, to the receptionist, who did not, for the rest of the morning, take her hand off the small intercom button under her desk. He took the elevator down. He stood in the lobby of the Flatiron Building at 9:20 on a Monday morning in May, with the journal under his arm and the camel coat over the other. And he did, very briefly, the small, unprofessional thing he had not done in a public lobby in any year since 2012. He stopped. He stood at the center of the marble floor for one count. Then he walked out into Fifth Avenue and got into the car that had been waiting for him for 12 minutes. And he went, not to the Crown offices on Park, but to the small townhouse on 62nd Street that had belonged to Catherine, and that he had not, in 14 years, allowed himself to use as an office. And he sat in the small upstairs room at the back of the second floor for the rest of the morning, with the door closed. He did not, in the small upstairs room, open the journal. He sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the small dogwood in the back garden, which Catherine, in 2008, had planted from a cutting. And he reconciled, in the slow, private, interior way he reconciled things he had been arranging not to reconcile for a long time, the sentence Daniel Hawthorne had said in the office, and the sentence Margot had not said in the conservatory, and the sentence Catherine, in the year before she died, had said to him at the foot of the bed in their old bedroom, which had been, "The trouble with you, my darling, is that you have always preferred to be right than to be loved." "Carefully now," Edward said, half to himself. He had, until Monday morning, considered that sentence a slander. He no longer did. That afternoon, Daniel walked the 11 blocks from the Flatiron office to the Crown offices on Park. And he did not, in the 11 blocks, telephone ahead. He went up to the foundation floor. He did not ask for Margot. He had not, since Friday evening, known where Margot was, and he had not, since Saturday morning, allowed himself to ask. He asked for the conference room. The communications director, who had been at the press lunch, and had not, since the press lunch, looked at him without something tightening in the corner of her face, walked into the conference room without speaking. She closed the door behind him. He set the folder on the long table. "All right," Daniel said to himself. He did not, when he set it down, open it. He set it square in front of the chair Margot, on Friday morning, would have been sitting in. He stood for one long count at the head of the table in his shirt sleeves, with his hands on the back of the chair, and he looked, for the first and last time in his life, at the small framed photograph on the wall opposite, of Catherine Crown, in 2009, in a hard hat, at the groundbreaking of the first housing site the Foundation had funded. And he said, into the room, the sentence he had been arranging not to say for 20 years. "This is the buyout that took my father's company," he said. "All of it." He set his hand flat on the folder. "Originals, where I have them. Copies of the rest. The signatures, the schedules, the bank correspondence." He said, "The personal note from your father to mine in November 2006 that I have, since I was 13, kept in a drawer." He withdrew his hand. "It is yours. I am sorry." He looked at the empty chair. "I will not, after today, be in this building again. I will, on Friday, sign the documents your father requires. I will not, on the second phase contract, take the underwrite. The Hawthorne firm will withdraw its bid by close of business today." He said, "If you, at any point in the next 6 months, want to know anything I have not said, my mobile is in the folder. Please use it. Please, otherwise, do not." He said, "Margot," he said, very quietly, into the empty conference room. "I love you. I have not earned the right to say it to your face. I am saying it to this room, because I owe it to the room as much as to you. I am, beginning today, going to spend the rest of my life arranging to be the kind of man who earns the right. He left the folder. He walked out. In the corridor he passed the communications director without looking at her, and the elevator without using it. And he took the 11 flights down the staff stair because he did not, in the elevator on a Monday afternoon, trust himself to be in a small space with another person. Margot, who had not been in the building when he came in, was at the door of the conference room 20 minutes later, holding the printed agenda for a meeting that had been moved. She saw the folder. She did not, for a long count, sit down. She did, eventually, sit down, in her own chair. She put both hands flat on the cool table, the way her mother had taught her to put her hands when she wanted to be still. She opened the folder. She did not, at first, read it. She lifted out the single sheet on the top. The small personal note from her father to Daniel's father in November 2006, on crown letterhead, in her father's handwriting, the handwriting she had been reading on Christmas cards her entire life. And she read the first line. "Steady," Daniel said quietly, to no one. "Mr. Hawthorne, I regret that the terms are what they are. I have, in this matter, exercised my own judgment." She set the page down. She did not cry. She had given that up at her mother's funeral. She had not, since, taken it back. She closed the folder. She did not, in the conference room, lift the small mobile number Daniel had printed in his own hand on the inside cover. She left it where he had set it down. "Quietly, my dear," Edward said, to no one. She rose. She walked, in the small, dignified elbow gesture of a crown in any room, to the door. She closed it behind her. She walked the long carpeted corridor to the small spare office 2 floors below the suite. She sat down in the chair Catherine had sat in. She opened the diary. She wrote on the next blank page, in the slow, careful hand she had used in the diary since she was 13, 1 line. "I do not, this evening, want to undo what I have done." She closed the diary. She went, by the long route, back to the small studio in Cobble Hill. "Carefully now," Edward said, half to himself. She did not, in the studio, on the Monday evening, sleep. Edward Crown came to the brownstone in Brooklyn at 6 on Tuesday morning. He had not, in any year of his life, been to Brooklyn at 6 on a Tuesday morning. He came in his own car. He drove it himself. He parked it on the small, leafy street 2 doors down from the brownstone, in front of the small bakery Daniel had taken to walking to, which was not yet open. He sat in the car for 1 full minute. He took, from the seat beside him, the small leather-bound book he had been holding on his lap, and he carried it in both hands up the small set of brownstone steps, and he rang the bell once. Daniel, who had not slept, opened the door in his trousers and a clean grey t-shirt. He did not, when he saw who was on the step, change his face. He had, since Monday afternoon, exhausted his face. He stepped aside. Edward came into the small front hall of the brownstone and stood, for a long count, on the small, old wooden floor that creaked under his shoes. "This was Catherine's," Edward said. He held out the small leather-bound book. Daniel took it. He did not, at first, open it. He looked, briefly, at the small embossed cherry leaf on the cover, and at the small frayed silk ribbon marking a page. And he looked, then, at Edward. "It is her garden journal," Edward said. Daniel said, after a count, "I have not, since the spring of 2012, opened it," Edward said. "I would like, in 100 years, for it to be back in this family." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, I would like it to be in the kitchen of a house in which someone is, this year, going to plant something." He looked at the floor. "I do not know whether you, or my daughter, or either of you, will plant anything in any garden in any year of your lives together. And I am not, this morning, in a position to know." He said, "I am, this morning, in a position to set this book down on a kitchen table that is not, in any building of mine, and to walk out, and to leave the rest to the 2 of you." he said. Catherine, he said, would have liked you. I'm sorry I did not. He turned. He walked out of the small front hall. He went down the brownstone steps. He got into his car. He drove, at the speed limit, back to the small townhouse on 62nd Street, and he did not, for the rest of the morning, open the journal that had arrived for him there at 7. Daniel, in the small front hall of the brownstone, stood for 1 full minute with the small leather-bound book in his hands. He carried it into the kitchen. He set it on the table. He sat down across from it. He did not, in the kitchen, at 6 in the morning, open it. He waited. Margot came at 9:30. She came in her own car. She used her own key. She did not, at the door, knock. She came into the small front hall in a thin coat and the wool socks Daniel had not seen on any other person's feet, and she stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, because Daniel was at the table in his trousers and a clean grey t-shirt, with his father's pocket watch on the table at his right hand, and the small leather-bound book on the table in front of him, and the morning May light in the small kitchen was the colour of a thing she had not, in any year of her life, expected to see again. She did not, in the doorway, speak. He did not, at the table, rise. He looked at her. He looked at his hands. He looked, briefly, at the watch. Your father, he said, very quietly, came at 6. He brought your mother's garden journal. He said she would have liked me. I have not opened it. I am waiting for you. Margot looked at the journal. She looked at the watch. She came into the kitchen. She did not, at first, sit down. She walked the small 2 paces to the table. She picked up the watch from the table at his right hand. She held it in her palm, the small, worn silver weight, and she felt, under her thumb, the small, steady, dry, methodical tick of a thing that had been ticking on a kitchen table in a small apartment in 2006, in front of a man who had not, in the end, been left much. She did not, at the table, ask whose it was. She knew. She walked, in the wool socks and the thin coat, to the small porcelain bowl by the door, where, on the Friday evening, she had left the wedding ring. The ring was still in the bowl. Quietly, my dear, Edward said, to no one. She set the watch in the bowl beside the ring. She turned. She came back into the kitchen. She sat down at the table opposite him. She put both hands flat on the cool wood. She looked, briefly, at the small leather-bound book between them. She did not, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in May, say, I forgive you. Because Margot Hawthorne, who had been Margot Crown and was, on this morning, learning how to be both, was a woman who had been raised in a house that did not, in any year, hand out a sentence like that without a year of work to back it. She opened the journal. She lifted the small, frayed silk ribbon from the page Catherine had been on in March of 2012, the last page Catherine had written on before the hospital, on which her mother, in her own slow, careful hand, had written, The tomato seedlings go in after the last frost. Edward, in his usual way, will say it is too soon. The garden, in its usual way, will know. Margot read it. She looked up. Carefully now, Edward said, half to himself. Daniel did not, in the kitchen, speak. She did not, in the kitchen, ask him to. She put her left hand, the hand with the smooth, small place where the ring was not, palm up on the table between them, in the small foreman gesture he had made in her father's kitchen on a Saturday morning in March, like a woman laying down a single tool she was not sure he would need. He put his hand in hers. He did not, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in May, take it back. Outside the kitchen window, the small back garden, in which nothing had yet been planted, sat in the May light at the angle that meant late spring. Quietly, my dear, Edward said to no one. The cherry wood in the stove was cold. The pocket watch, in the small porcelain bowl by the door, ticked once, dry and methodical, and was, in that kitchen, no longer the loudest thing in it. In the last week of May, the small back garden behind the brownstone was finally warm enough. Margot put on Daniel's old grey crewneck sweater and the wool socks and a pair of canvas trousers she had bought on a Saturday in Brooklyn at a shop that did not sell to crowns. She carried the small tray of tomato seedlings down the back step into the garden. She set the tray on the small old wooden bench Daniel had repaired on the second weekend of their tenancy with a piece of cedar he had had in the back of his truck. She sat on the bench. She put her hands flat on her thighs. She looked, for one long count, at the small bare patch of earth at the back of the garden against the brick wall. She had not, since 2012, planted anything. She had not, since 2012, allowed herself to know that she had not planted anything. "Steady," Daniel said quietly to no one. She picked up the trowel. She knelt. She broke the earth. She made the small, careful row her mother's journal had described, in the kind of slow, precise hand a woman uses when she is teaching a daughter how to do a thing she has never, herself, done. She set the seedlings, one by one, into the row. She pressed the earth back around them with both thumbs. She watered them, from the small old tin can Daniel had taken off the back of a job site in February and had cleaned for the kitchen, and which had, in the last week, found its way out into the garden. She sat back on her heels. She brushed her hands on her thighs. The earth, on her palms, was the warm, dry, friable colour of a New York garden at the end of May. The brick wall behind the row was the dark old brick of a brownstone that had stood on the street since 1903 and had, in that 120 years, been planted in by perhaps 15 women in succession. The sun, across the small garden, came in at the angle that, in this part of the city, meant the long evening was about to begin. She heard the front door open. "Carefully now," Daniel said to himself. She heard the small foreman step on the long old wooden floor of the hall. She heard the small, soft creak in front of the kitchen door, where, in the last month, Daniel had taken to setting down his keys very quietly, the way he had taken to doing all of his small, ordinary actions very quietly, in the long, careful way of a man who was learning. In the small, private way a man learns such things, the difference between earning and being given. He came down the back step. He had the brown paper bag from the small bakery 2 doors down. He stopped at the edge of the garden, with the bag in one hand. He looked at the row. He looked at her, on her heels, with the earth on her palms, in his sweater, in his socks. "Bread," he said. "Bread," she said. He came across the small lawn. He set the bag on the bench. He sat down on the bench beside her. He did not, at the bench, touch her. He did not, in the small garden, speak. He looked at the row of seedlings against the brick wall, and at the small, old tin can on its side in the grass, and at the small leather-bound book on the bench beside the brown paper bag, which she had brought out into the garden so that her mother's hand could be in the open air for the first time in 14 years. He cleared his throat. He looked at her. He said, very quietly, in the small carpenter's voice he had used in her father's kitchen on the morning after the wedding, "What do you actually grow? Not what you let the people who have grown things for you for 28 years assume you grow. What you grow. What you would grow if no one was watching." Margot brushed the earth off her palms. She did not, in the small garden, look at him. "Tomatoes," she said. "Badly. And then, in July, basil, which my mother said no crown has ever, in 3 generations, kept alive. I am not interested in being the first. I am interested in trying." He laughed. It was the small, unguarded laugh he had laughed at the altar in March. It was the laugh of a man who had, in the months between, learned how to laugh in a kitchen in his own house, without an audience. "There," Margot said, brushing the last of the earth off her palms. "We'll see if I'm any good at this." Daniel, on the bench, did not, for a long count, answer. He sat in the small garden, in the small evening light at the end of May, with his wife, in his sweater, on the bench beside him, and his father's pocket watch in the small porcelain bowl in the front hall, 2 rooms away. And he understood, with the small, clean clarity of a man who had spent 20 years carrying a watch into rooms his father had not, in the end, been left much of, that the watch was, on this evening, finally in a house in which it did not, in any room, need to tick. He reached for the bread. He cut it on the small wooden board they had carried out into the garden. He passed her a piece. She took it. She ate it. She made the small, private face she made when she ate something she had not, in advance, expected to enjoy. She passed her hand, palm up, onto the bench between them, in the small foreman gesture she had been borrowing, all spring, from her husband. He put his hand in hers. He did not, in the small garden at the end of May, take it back. Above them, in the small, leafy tree at the back of the brownstone, a bird that neither of them had learned the name of yet sang, briefly, twice, and was quiet.